Please join me on my path to create a day-to-night transition time-lapse with the Benro Polaris. We will need additional software, like Adobe Lightroom, LR Time-Lapse and other tools. To plan the shooting session, I use the application Stellarium. Set your desired location in Stellarium, and you are ready to simulate the sunset. In my case, I already set up a 360 degrees picture within Stellarium, to exactly see where and when the sun sets. My plan for the time-lapse is to have 1 hour of sunlight, 1 hour blue hour, and a half hour of night. According to Stellarium, my session needs to start at 4 p.m. and end at 6:30. This means the session will take 2.5 hours. With my planned interval of 15 seconds, this means 600 frames, which results in around 20 seconds of final video. But with the expected temperatures of below zero, my Canon batteries will not last long enough and die before the session is over. I therefore power my camera with a 20 ampere power delivery power bank, connected to my camera with a USB battery dummy. With this dummy battery, power bank combination, 24-hour time-lapse sessions are realistic. If you need longer time frames, you should consider connecting the battery to a fixed power socket with a 2.4 ampere USB charger. I will provide the links to these products in the description below. The batteries are attached to the tripod with strong Velcro to keep them in place. I use a second power bank to power the dew heater. Before I connect the camera to the Polaris, I open the aperture to its widest position and focus manually on a faraway point. This ensures pinpoint stars, later at night. Then I close the aperture again, expose correctly and connect the camera. Now I select the Pathlapse mode and position the Polaris to my preferred starting point of the time lapse. By tapping on the plus sign, the starting point is now registered. Using the joystick, I turn the Polaris to my selected end point of the time lapse. The roughly 45 degrees angle is about the maximum you should use for a 20 seconds 4K video. Tapping on the plus symbol again confirms the end point. You now have the possibility to add additional points, but this complicates things too much. With the setting of the second position, you now can set the desired interval. Please take notice. You need to set it at least to 2 seconds, better are 3. Because the camera needs time to store the raw picture and send the JPEG to the Polaris. If you set it to short, it can happen that the Polaris fires the next shot, but the camera is not ready yet. This will result in the shot failed error message, and this frame will be skipped. I set the number of shots to 600. You can ignore the FPS setting, as it is only used to calculate the expected duration of the final video. As the Polaris does not render the video by itself, you can ignore it. I do not want the Polaris to render the video anyway, as I do not want the JPEGs to be used and want to adjust the pictures in post. It always produces better results when using the raw files, where you can adjust the colors and white balance in post. Please ensure you have the histogram visible. Now everything is set up and ready to go. You now can start the time-lapse by sliding the record button upwards. The Polaris now rotates to the start position and takes the first shot. The histogram is now your important indicator to monitor the exposure. With the sun being in the frame, the histogram will always have the indication of some overexposure on the right side. But apart from the sun, the majority of your light should be indicated in the middle of the graph. In our day-to-night time-lapse, we expect the available light to decrease, and need adjust our exposure settings respectively. For optimal results, and smooth picture-to-picture transitions, you should follow the following steps to change the exposure. As the first phase, step by step, increase your exposure time first. Leave the aperture and ISO untouched. This means reduce your shutter speed until you reach the maximum time you are willing to expose. In my example, these are 10 seconds. In other time lapses I used up to 30 seconds, but this will result in star trails at night. As you can clearly see in the histogram, the exposure is getting too low. I need to adjust the exposure time. To do this, I tap on the camera settings indicator in the Polaris app to open the camera settings. Here I can increase the shutter speed.
A few moments later. A few moments later.
Once you have reached your maximum exposure time, start opening your aperture to let more light in. Do this the same way, tap on the camera settings and choose a smaller f-stop value. Unfortunately, the Polaris app randomly refuses to react on the tap on the camera settings. All other buttons stay reactive. It is just the camera settings that refuse to open. This is extremely obstructive as I now need to disconnect the camera from the USB mode dial and the changes manually on the camera, and connect the camera again. With this action I usually miss 1 or 2 frames, which results in a jitter in the final time-lapse. Some time later it starts to work again. This bug urgently needs to be fixed by Benro.
2 hours later.
Once the sequence is done, and everybody survived without freezing, I delete all JPEGs, and copy all the raw images to my computer. From here, I use the application LR Timelapse created by Günters to analyze the sequence. This fantastic tool analyzes the different exposure settings, and can automatically add adjustments to the exposure, to reduce flickering. As a first step, I define 6 keyframes to edit them in Adobe Lightroom. Once the keyframes are edited, I use LR Timelapse to reduce the flicker. If I had the Pro version of LR Timelapse, I could directly render the video. But as I do not, I export the pictures out of Lightroom and import them as an image sequence in Premiere Pro, and render them there. As you can see in the final result, this timelapse has several issues. First of all, the rising fog completely destroys it, as it is much too fast. Secondly, the skipped frames, where I had to manually adjust the exposure settings on the camera, are clearly disrupting the smooth movement. I hope Benro fixes this bug soon. But repeating it several days later, with a tighter lens, a smaller rotation angle and more luck with the weather, I could get the result I wanted. I hope you like this video and it helps you to create cool time lapses with the Benro Polaris.